Welcome, everyone. So, thanks for being part of Kriya's Rethink Evening, and we're collaborating with Women and Media Collective to do this. And these evenings are part of a series of events that we are actually having in all over the world for people to come and just have a fun evening that looks at some hard issues that feminism is dealing with, and just be able to think about those issues. There are no answers probably this evening, but you'll definitely have a lot of food for thought. Kriya's a feminist organization and a feminist human rights organization that works on sexuality, gender, and rights. But I think what mostly we try to do is see and reflect on the fault lines of different movements as they interact with feminism and our own feminist history of working in India and where we've kind of had tussles with the feminist movement. So you can imagine the Me Too, and we bring some of that. So I hope everybody will enjoy, come to all our future ones, and I'm handing it back to Subha.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start, and I'm going to start by reading something that is an essay that was written by Sunila Abesekara, who was a pretty kind of quite a well-known women's human rights defender and feminist who was from Sri Lanka and was also queer and kind of occupied multiple spaces and wore many hats. And was also my mother, and she died in, just wanted to leave that. She died in 2013, and so for me, because this is kind of like, was also about finding a way to tell our stories in a kind of a subjective way, but talk about how our politics were shaped. So obviously my queer feminism really begins right there at birth. So in that I was born to a queer feminist, so it was, kind of, that's how my politics was shaped, always in a very personal and subjective way. And I'm going to read something that was an essay she wrote in 1999, which is quite a long time ago. But if you think about some of the stuff that she's saying then, it's kind of alarming how relevant it remains. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read excerpts. But the essay is called "Sexuality a Feminist Issue?" ? And it's, as Geeta was saying, people have been actually asking this question for a long time, like, is it a feminist issue? And I mean, when you can read the essay, and I mean, obviously she's saying, yes, it is. But it hasn't always been that easy for us to claim that, right? So I'll just start with reading. In more recent times, the discussion about sexuality has become focused on alternative sexual practices. In some fora, speaking about sexuality has become synonymous with speaking about lesbians. Yet, in actual fact, the concept of sexuality encompasses a wide range of sexual behavior and practice that is alternative to the dominant mode. It could include homosexuals, gays, and lesbians, but certainly also from the point of view of the struggle for sexual self-determination and sexual autonomy of women, this category could include single women, widows, celibates. Some of these women have been prohibited from having sex by the state, by religion, or by the community, on the basis that they are too young, too old, married, unmarried, virgins who must guard their hymen, since it is the most valuable object they possess. Some could be women who have decided not to have sex with men. Others could be women who have decided not to have sex at all. All of them are women who defy mainstream sexual codes and patterns of behavior and are therefore particularly vulnerable to punishment. Sexual transgression is a heinous crime in most of our societies today. What constitutes sexuality? Sexual practice, certainly. Sexual preference, who you have sex with and how. Sexual desire, sexual pleasure. How you derive sexual pleasure and what your sexual fantasies are. What you dream of when you dream about sex. Who do you find sexy and why? Within the women's movement, the issue of sexuality has been a difficult area of discussion. Feminists who are ready to challenge many stereotypes and to defy the norms of monogamous marriage and the nuclear family were, at least right up to the early 80s, reluctant to take on issues of sexuality as a part of our own agenda. Part of it was perhaps self-interest. By the mid-1980s, we had achieved a certain degree of acceptance and recognition that we didn't want to endanger by raising troublesome and controversial issues. We wanted some space in which to enjoy the fruits of our labor. We feared the backlash from the conservative and right-wing groups who viewed unfettered sexuality as an aberration, as flying in the face of God. We didn't want to be called lesbians. We wanted to enter the mainstream as legitimate actors in the male world. In our desire to break the glass ceiling, we forgot many of our sisters, the ones who were as oppressed by class differences, by racism, or by compulsory heterosexuality as they were by patriarchy. Our theoretical and conceptual understanding of patriarchy extended an understanding of the ways in which it interacted with other axes of power, such as capitalism and various ideologies of racial or ethnic supremacy. However, it didn't really include any deep understanding of differences within and among women. Our belief in sisterhood and solidarity proved to be very deceptive. So I'm going to end there, but I'm just going to make a connection that for me, I think that's how I kind of came into queerness really as a politics, because more than as an identity. And I think for me, that's a queer framework, like to say that it's not just about people who are having sex with people of the same gender, but it's about anyone that's defying the norm or disrupting the norm. And for me, I think that's always been the framework of queerness that I've tried to interact with and uphold in my own politics. And I think we were going to go to Uruj next.
So I wanted to show Sabine Mahmood's clip. How many folks know about Sabine Mahmood? Mariam, of course. Anyone else? Okay, so I wanted to start by her sharing her own story. She's from Karachi, like myself. And I will come back to her story and talk about my connection to my queerness and being from Pakistan.
In order to feel idealistic and productive in an environment like this, you have to create some sort of buffer. You have to protect yourself from the doom and the gloom and the newspapers and television and that onslaught, that relentless onslaught of bad news, because it can get anyone down. And I feel what we've done here at the second floor is create that island. Sometimes it just feels fragile and ridiculous, but then the next day you think, okay, at least this exists, it's real. People get an opportunity to take their minds off of whatever's going on, and we're, an open space, and it's open to all and anyone who chooses to walk through its doors, and it's a model. It's a template for other people to create similar public spaces in other areas of the city, and maybe, those are the only, that is the respite that we need from the violence and the anguish sometimes that you can't help but feel. Everyone gets mugged and looted pretty regularly. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. People don't feel safe. I have a very cavalier attitude to fear, so maybe, I don't care. I just feel when the time comes, the time will come. And so I drive around, I go where I want, I walk on the streets. I grew up playing cricket on the streets, but that's not most people.
So Sabine has this famous quote. She said, fear is a line in your head, and you can make the choice of which side you'll be on. Sabine was a feminist and created this amazing space in Karachi called the Second Floor. It's still around, but Sabine herself was murdered in 2015. And so when I think about my icons and people that I look up to, she was absolutely one of those people, and her death was extremely heartbreaking. But my own journey started to coming back to Pakistan and to coming back to my queerness in the context of Pakistan before then, but Sabine was part of that journey. I grew up in Pakistan, in Karachi, and when I was growing up there, I had, it was this sense of difference that I had that wasn't, no one was talking about it, no one was talking about feminism, and I was starting to shut down in my teenage years, and I was really reacting to sort of the gender constructs that I was told to kind of be to comply with. The other big thing was that in the 80s in Pakistan, there was a dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq, who was the first dictator in Pakistan that really conflated the idea of Islam and the nation state. And that had a huge impact, and we're still suffering from it sort of in the way that so many rights of minorities and women were completely thrown under the bus in the name of Islam to create this really strong nation state. And so my relationship to Islam was complicated. And when my family immigrated to the US and I was 17, I really wanted to just get away from it all. Like I wanted to get away from Pakistan and from Islam. But being here in the US and coming out here, I came out in 19, and I started realizing that actually assimilation wasn't the answer. Like I was actually getting really depressed, and I wasn't really relating to the white LGBT community in my college where I came out. And so I started realizing myself as a person of color in this country, in this certain way that I was racialized here. And really after September 11th is when I started to understand myself coming back to my Muslim identity as a political identity for me, because I started seeing how much there was so much Islamophobia, and especially in this very unique way that Islam was being used to justify the war on terror. It was used to justify the occupation of Afghanistan, for example, and when even feminist organizations like Feminist Majority were going around saying, oh, we're liberating the women of Afghanistan, you know, white feminists were buying into the war on terror. And to me, that was unacceptable. And to me, that related to my queer identity, that I wasn't willing to use my queerness as a way to justify Islamophobia. And so that's really where my activism started becoming really sharpened in the way that it was all kind of coming together. And then I wanted to start going back to Pakistan. I really felt that, you know, there is so much Islamophobic narrative about Pakistan. Every time people talk about Pakistan, and especially around queerness and women's rights, it's always like, despite terrorism or despite, you know, all of these things, the women are surviving, or women are, you know, and I was just sick of that narrative, because I think that it feeds back into the Islamophobic narrative here about saving Muslim women, of saving Muslim women from themselves, from their cultures, from their communities. And so Sabine was one of those people that was super inspiring to me, for me to know that someone like her existed. And so when I first went back to Pakistan in 2011, and I've been going back pretty much every year ever since, I went to the second floor in Karachi, and to go back to my own city and to be in this beautiful space was just so, it was just so affirming. And to me, that has meant everything. And so even though Sabine was killed, and, you know, and that moment when, and she was killed because of her work on Balochistan. So that's something else to think about in terms of Pakistani work. Like, you can't isolate LGBTQ work from other work that is happening, other resistance movements that are happening. And so even though she's queer, that wasn't the identity that she was killed for. She was killed because she supported Balochi activists who wanted a space to talk about their uprising in Balochistan that the Pakistani government has completely shut down. And so to this day, you know, we know who killed her, but those people are not being held accountable, and people disappear all the time. But despite all that, I have so much hope. I don't know if you all followed the Aurat March in Pakistan that happened on the International Women's Human Rights Day. Beautiful, beautiful march of women and allies all over different cities in Pakistan. Thousands of people mobilized, amazing signs, amazing movement. And we'll talk more about the Me Too stuff as well. But it's like, you know, you kill Sabine, but now there are thousands of Sabines. And to me, that is really beautiful.
Great. Thank you so much, Uruj. Actually an LGBT icon, right? So I was growing up as a young queer Muslim girl, and Uruj was one of the first people that every time you heard queer Muslim, Uruj's name would come up. So I just want to say that I'm like almost in my mid-20s, and this is my life right now. So we started the event with Abida Parveen. My name is Sharmin Hussain, and I am a Bangladeshi queer Muslim from Queens, Get the Money, New York. And we started with Abida Parveen, which I recognize as a queer icon too. So Abida is a Sufi who doesn't identify as man or woman. So she is one of the first like pop culture like icons that are flipping the script on gender in subversive ways. And for femmes like us, like she is phenomenal. Like who sees a butch femme take up space the way they do, the way Abida does in Bollywood, in South Asian like pop culture? No one. So Abida is a name that you all should know. And listen to their music. It's like amazing. So growing up in Queens, you know, I never really had a coming out process that was like, hey, I'm gay now. I think it happened when like I noticed most of my like female identified friends weren't having orgasms, or they didn't know what an abortion was. And I was like that person that was like, you should go to Planned Parenthood, or like, you should know what an orgasm is. So I think like being queer always meant being that friend, right? That was like, oh, your boyfriend hits you? Like, this is a lot, right? So I think like being queer took that formation where I was always against the patriarchy, always against, you know, male dominance. And I think being queer took its like journey when I started realizing that a lot of the ways that I was defying patriarchy, you know, I wore hijab for 13 years. And it meant that I was protecting myself against patriarchy all the time with a hijab on. And then I was like, oh, like here I am presenting as straight with the hijab. And I knew that it was one of the only ways that I could identify with the larger Muslim community. I came from a very Bangladeshi family in Queens. So that meant that I had a lot of heteronormativity around me, a lot of like, you know, I like that term your mother used, which was like forced heterosexuality, right? And that was the way that I knew that, oh, this doesn't rock with me. So I got politicized young at East Coast Solidarity Summer, which is a South Asian political education camp. It's based in the East Coast. And Sasha and I actually founded it in like 2000 and like, I want to say 12, 13, right? Like, well, we founded the new chapter of it. So DC Desi Summer was the original. We founded the new version of it because, you know, a lot of South Asian organizing comes in waves and then it builds again. So we had explicitly queer feminist space that wasn't there before. So before, a lot of South Asian political education work was a response to the rise of Hindutva in like the early 90s, which was Hindu fundamentalism, right? So then that wave died up, and then we came back as queer feminists that needed a space. So my identity mostly is with the Bangladeshi feminists that I work with day in and day out. So I also founded the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective as a space for queer Muslim feminists to get together. So it's one of the first spaces that I actually bond with other straight Bangladeshi women. And that was so rare for me to have aunties that I like actually love me for who I was such a rare feeling that we decided to solidify it. And now we are a collective. And it's really awesome work that we get to do in New York because there's over 100,000 Bangladeshis in New York alone. So even though there is the domination of India in the South Asian politic, Bangladesh is New York. Right? Like we represent a huge population here. So we have a lot of work that's being done, language justice, immigrant justice. You know, when you looked at the Muslim ban, it was Bangladeshis and Pakistanis that actually occupied JFK, right? Terminal 4. So it was us who did that groundwork to fight for the folks that are, you know, getting deported after 9/11. So these organizations are led by folks who are considered minorities in the South Asian diaspora. But in New York, we are like the badasses that are teaching people how to be intersectional, how to be, you know, fighting against Hindu domination, which is happening in our diaspora. But then also Uruj and I come from a diaspora that's seeing the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. So we have to hold that, right? With the rise of Islamophobia, how do we also hold a story about what's happening in our home countries where Islamist parties are killing, murdering, kidnapping activists, secular activists, queer activists, anybody who speaks up against the ruling parties. So I come from that history, and every day I'm trying to think of what is my response to this, you know, post 2015, 2016, where these murders have happened, where, you know, the narrative is now that Bangladeshi queerness has died after the public murders of Zulhaz and Tonnoy who were murdered in Bangladesh. So how do you respond to that? Death, queer death, you know? And now a lot of us are in hiding. A lot of us had to leave. A lot of queer Bangladeshis are not public anymore. One of the leading LGBTQ organizations in Bangladesh has had to go underground. So Rootban is the name of the organization. So in that, you know, in that story, how do we fit in is always my question.
Hey folks, how's everybody doing? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Sasha Wijayaratna. I really well, first I'm actually really honored to be on a panel with all of these really incredible people. Some of whom I've known for a long time. I did not know who your mother was, and I'm a little like surprised. I'm also Sri Lankan, so having a little bit of a moment. I really came into queer and trans work through organizations, through a GSA in high school, through a community organization in Philly. That was a queer and trans Pan-Asian organization. It's part of a national queer and trans API organization. And so a lot of my thoughts around both identity and also the politics of queer and trans organizing is really through these different organizations. So I'm just sharing some reflections around that. So I, as of like 5 months ago, worked at the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, or NCAPIA, and I just transitioned here to New York to CAB, Organizing Asian Communities. And so in that transition, going from working at a queer and trans organization to working at a really incredible left API organization that's not exclusively queer and trans, I think like it's really affirmed for me the need that we have for queer and trans specific orgs, right? For us to be organizing by and for and with each other. And also really highlighted some of the tensions in our movement spaces. And so, like, I think there is a way that queer and trans orgs really, we really shape who we are. We shape our identities, we shape our histories, and we deserve the space to organize by and for and with each other for queer and trans futures. And at the same time, in the spaces that I've been in, which is just particular the spaces that I've been in, not movement-wide, like we've really struggled to build power rooted in working class communities. And that's a tension that kind of floats around and that we don't talk about very often. And I think, you know, one of the reflections from that is, like, what is our end goal or end game here, right? Are we looking to transform the identity of what it means to be queer and trans, or are we looking to transform the systems that actually cause us harm? And it's often both, but that if we're looking to transform those systems, we actually have to shift our approach and do a better job of working in and more deeply in working class communities, because obviously our people are everywhere. But again, in the spaces that I've been in, we've had a really hard time finding folks and had a really hard time actually transforming our organizations enough to be able to build real working class power. And especially being in New York, I would say, again, like that's been my experience in the work. I don't think that's true for everybody. So there are legacies of Fierce and the Audre Lorde Project, Queers for Economic Justice, all based here that I think really took on that project, took on that work, and showed us some of the different ways that that work is actually very deeply possible. And I think for us in API community and South Asian community, like we actually have to look at those histories and figure out how we build that in our own communities too. The last thing I will say related to that is that there's, I think sometimes a tendency in our communities, in our movements, to really prioritize words over actions. And just a story to tell around that is that I remember being at a training, it doesn't matter where or who, but where, you know, they have everybody share pronouns. At the time, like I was figuring out my own shit around gender, so I asked to use he, him, if folks would use he, him pronouns. Most of the people in the room kind of heard that, nodded, it was cool. And it was a training that was cross-class and also cross-language. And there was somebody there who was really sweet, who we had been talking sort of back and forth, getting to know each other, both English and Spanish, who had just kept calling me she. And it wasn't intentional. I think like what pronouns are and what they mean wasn't really explained. And the facilitator came down on her really hard. And, you know, I would say like he was doing what he thought was his job. And I'm not like, and that's okay, right? But it was, he just kept saying like, hey, that's not right. Hey, you're doing it wrong. Hey, that's not right. And I remember sitting there going like, not on my body. Like, you do not get to make someone feel like they don't know what they're doing, like they're not smart enough, they're not educated enough, they don't speak the language enough, and say that it's for me. Like, that's not what I want. That's not what feels safe to me. And it's not that I think queer and trans folks don't deserve to be called the names that we want, the pronouns that we want, right? That's not negotiable. And this person in different ways throughout this training had showed up for me, right? Had been like, hey, you didn't get a chance to speak yet. Hey, do you want food, right? Like, there were ways that we were building where I knew that she had my back. I didn't need someone to make her feel small in order to get my pronouns right. And I remember sitting in that moment and going like, damn, we have so much cross-movement work to do. Like, these are, like, this is tiny moment, it's a one-on-one interaction, but like, damn, does it speak to the fissures in our movements. And actual last piece is that, other thing I will say is that there, you know, like, queer and trans folks get told that we're impossible all the time, that we're not legible, that we shouldn't exist. And that's what working class people and organizations and movements get told too. And I think there is such a possibility, going back to what you were saying earlier of like, you know, how do we think more broadly about queerness and the possibilities of queerness? Like, what incredible opportunities exist there for solidarity? Again, not saying those spaces are exclusive to each other, but like, what possibilities exist? And, you know, in CAV was one of the organizations that just took on Amazon, and we got told time and time again that it's impossible, you'll never win. And our response was always like, well, then why are you organizing? Like, if you think that this is a fight we could never win, it's too impossible, then get out of the game and get out of the way, right? Like, if you're not willing to fight impossible battles, move and let us do it. Because we've always been told we're impossible. We've always been told that what we want or need is impossible. And so we're not afraid of impossible. We'll fight impossible battles and we will win, right? So I just leave that, like, that's so shared across our movements. Yeah, that's so shared across our movements that, like, we have to build that solidarity. Again, without pretending that folks don't exist at those intersections, but we have to build that solidarity, because that's what lives in all of our bodies, that we can fight impossible battles and we can fucking win. Don't know if I'm supposed to start. Ahead of myself.
Oh my God, I don't know what I'm supposed to say after that. So my name is Anka Khan, and I'm going to start off by reading a poem by Fatima Askar, who is a queer Kashmiri American Muslim poet. Main na bhulunga, translation, I won't forget. My father, sideburns down the length of his face, my age now, and ripe my age now, and alive, his husky voices crackle, like the night's wind through cornfields of bell-bottoms, fields of pomade. My mother's overlarge sunglasses crowded on her face, crowded in the only English movie theater that plays Amitabh Bachchan. My mother watching the blown-out screen, the smoke spilling from light, how he is able to be in all places at once, all the places she can't be, the man on the screen, a kind of God, maybe a kind of God, maybe my grief at all places at once, replaying their every story, a kind of God, maybe my father's nazar, his long look, his luck-laced lungs, breathing my mom's hands in the theater as they whisper next to my father's, the almost touch, blood electric, my father watching her, his sideways glance on her thick eyelashes, so long it's as if she never blinks. My father's stomach blinks, and 1,000 Amitabh Bachchans blink his insides, his heart pumps, Main na bhulunga on beat, Main na bhulunga in chorus, Main na bhulunga. The theater singing my mother's ghost fingers on his palm, and maybe this is what falling in love is like, a more handsome man, jumbling the intestines, a more handsome man belting the song to the woman with the long eyelashes in the theater, and you, afraid to blink in case she disappears, in case it was smoke this whole time. So I mean, that poem was straight, but I think, I think on reading this, I think it was really one of the first times that I heard Kashmiri stories of love, really. Because so often when we hear the narrative about Kashmir, it's always about occupation and violence, and justifiably so. That is a thing that our people I'm Kashmiri, I should have said that, that we're enduring. But I think that makes it so that spending the time and the energy and the devotion on love becomes a queer act of resistance in of itself. And I think that oftentimes, I know this sentiment has been said by a couple of folks already, but I do think that queer is so often a state of mind, right? You queer something by treating it in a non-normative way, by doing something where it shouldn't exist, where it's never been given space to exist before. And so when I think about my queerness, I think that it is so clearly derived from Kashmiriness, from the way that the Kashmiri women in my family so clearly queer gender specifically, and how, you know, like when you come from like a working class, rural Kashmiri family where like the men are, you know, they go out to like the Gulf Arab countries for 10 months out of a year to go work hard labor jobs, and the women are left to run whole families, whole communities, whole everythings by themselves, and how that is so queer in and of itself, because the way that we often so hear about gender is in such a strictly confined role that like you do this and you do that. But the Kashmiri women in my life have never abided by that role ever. That's never ever been the case. And I mean, this is my own theory, but if their husbands are gone for 10 months out of a year, there might be some stuff happening with it. I don't know. I'm not gonna project. But like all that to say is that everything about it is queer. Everything that I was taught about being a woman is queer, which is then I was like, oh, I'm not a woman. This makes sense. But I think that, and also Islam in a very real sense also taught me a lot about queerness, because I think Islam, when we talk about like the historic context of Islam, it was very, very jarring for its time. It broke a lot of binaries. It broke a lot of old traditions where they existed in the Arab world. And every time I think about my queerness, I think about how the presence of it is breaking something all the time, whether that's my gender queerness, whether that's my sexuality queerness, whether that's my existence in a white queer space, whether that's my existence in a Muslim space, wherever it is, there is something that is queer about me all the time. And I love it, so I'm not complaining at all.
Hi, so I'm Geeta Misra, and I have, while preparing for this, which I didn't have a lot of time for, I thought I kept trying to look for things written by Indians, then I expanded to South Asian, and then I said, what the hell? You know, I should be able to look, you know, just tell, you know, whatever I want to tell this group and do a reading from anyone I like. And that's the first point I wanted to make, which is very often being queer, being lesbian, you're asked to speak about that subject, as if you cannot speak about any other subject. And you know, that's one of the things about queering, how we have internalized what we say to people, what issues we speak on. So actually, if it wasn't for a panel of South Asian queer women, that is so rare, the last time I think was 2011, and it was at a Kriya conference, I wouldn't be speaking about queer issues. I may want to speak about the environment or something I may know less about. But so anyway, I'm going to start with a poem that I love. It's one of my favorite poems. And it's a poem I love because it kind of turns things on its head, just like how I like to live my life sometimes, and how maybe we do our work sometimes at Kriya. So I'm going to read the poem and then just talk about a couple of stories that have stuck with me as being a feminist, as being queer, and as having to choose between different identities. So here's the poem. So this is a poem by Nikki Giovanni, and it's called I Wrote a Good Omelette. Have people read it? Yes, some people have, yeah. So it is, I wrote a good omelette and ate a hot poem after loving you, buttoned my car and drove my coat home in the rain after loving you. I goed on red and stopped on green, floating somewhere in between, being here and being there after loving you. I rolled my bed, turned down my hair, slightly confused, but I don't care. Laid out my teeth and gargled my gown, and then I stood and laid me down to sleep after loving you. So that's the poem that I like. So I think the three stories I want to talk about are stories that come from engaging with the feminist movement in India. And the first one is when the film Fire came out. A lot of people know that Fire was a film that did more for issues of queer women, lesbian women in India, maybe than a lot of our non-profit, NGOs. And it was about two women in the middle class that fall in love and have a relationship. And when this film came out, the theaters were attacked, the filmmakers were attacked, and there was a march that was organized by women's feminist organizations, which was built on the idea that this film, the filmmakers should not be censored. There's an idea of freedom of expression, that people should express themselves freely, what's going on in India if we start, attacking theaters. And there was a small emerging lesbian queer organization that also wanted to take part in this march. And they wanted to have their own banner, which said the word lesbian in it. And to me, it was striking because I was in this room when there was a discussion between the feminists who were organizing the march and saying, please, we would love for you to march with us, but please don't hold up your banner. Just march with us around freedom of expression. But they had no idea that in that moment, they were denying another group their freedom of expression. So that really struck me. And this I'm talking about in 96 or something. The second story I want to tell is about, going to the March 8th march in India, which is a huge march. And one year, this march was organized by the sex workers. It was highly organized. There were thousands of sex workers. They had all the permissions. They had all the flyers. And some of us, of course, joined that march because we worked on sex worker issues. And as we went down the march, we saw there were a lot of groups waiting to march because there's a time you're given and we kept asking people to join us. So did the sex workers. There was the Dalit rights organization, and none of these organizations joined the march. And they said, no, ours is a Dalit march. Ours is a women's rights march. And it was really striking that this process of conjoining movements, didn't happen. And then the third story I want to tell is from the conference that Kriya did in 2011, which was called Count Me In. And the work emerged from thinking about our work on violence against women. Like, why do we leave out certain women when we talk about violence? Why don't we ever see a photograph in domestic violence, advocacy material where the rape of a girl who's smoking and wearing a short cigarette is equally, is there? We did a scan of posters and there were always these respectable looking women. And I realized that the project of feminism and respectability really needs to be taken apart. There was a way in which a rape of a sex worker was never seen as rape. There was a way in which we were very easily behind laws that said domestic violence. Why the word domestic? People are abused outside the domestic sphere. And that led to really thinking about how do we create a space where there is solidarity across women at the margins of women, at least because of their gender, ability, sexuality. So the incident from 2011 at this conference was, so we brought together trans people, sex workers, lesbian women, women with disabilities, because they are also seen as asexual, in a common space. And I remember clearly sitting in the opening session where I heard the people with disabilities, women with disabilities, kind of freaking out because they were sitting next to sex workers. They were like, oh my God, I'm sitting next to a sex worker. I heard sex workers say, oh my God, when people with disabilities want to have sex and they want to have babies and they can dance, because there was a lot of performative. I heard the trans people say, this has nothing to do with us. This is not, these are not our issues. We're dealing with a whole other set of issues. The lesbians, I don't know, they were probably sitting on couches in the corner, just trying to find a date that night. I don't know. But, but you know, the thing is when you organize, and I think what emerged from that moment was this idea of how we do cross-movement work. How do we create spaces where across movements we are talking to each other, where, you know, people's rights are taken, you know, very seriously, and that the claims of one movement are not kind of denying the claims of another movement.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just feel like what's kind of resonating with me, and it was kind of across what all of you were saying, I think, is this thing of identity and how we are always kind of have this kind of tension or conflict around identity, right? And then we have our politics, and then we have our work. And I think what I'm hearing that we're all kind of saying, and this is kind of coming from our context as well, is that it's quite interesting having this conversation, because we don't actually have the same approach to identity, right? Like it's not something that we that comes naturally to us politically. Like we don't organize around identity. That's not something that many of our movements do in Sri Lanka, and I know it's not really the case in India as well with a lot of our movements. But obviously, identity is there. Like it is obviously a part of us, and it's also multi-layered, right? It is embodied. As much as, you know, we're all gonna sit around and be like, oh, social construction, et cetera, but we do feel that they are embodied, right? There's a lot of our identities that we feel are inside us and are embodied. So they are constructed, but they're also embodied. They're also political constructs as much as they are social constructs. And I really I'm thinking about what you said, Sasha, and what you said, Geeta, this thing of how even in our own organizing and even in our own work, there's still people at the margins that we're not always centering. And yet we're out there asking people to include us, right? And the whole kind of language and the rhetoric around inclusivity, which still assumes that there's someone in the middle that can do the job of including, right? There's someone still that's at the center that has that authority somehow. And I think, I mean, I can tell a story in terms of what's one of the, I think, major transitions that have happened with queer organizing in Sri Lanka recently. It's similar to something that, like what you were saying, Geeta, that I don't know if people in the room know, but in the last 6 months, from like October at the end of last year, there was a huge kind of political crisis in Sri Lanka. There was an attempt at a power grab from the former regime, etc. I mean, it was a whole thing. A non-violent coup, basically. And then, I mean, so there was a lot of organizing around that. Obviously, we were protesting every day, and all kinds of people were protesting, right? I mean, all kinds of people. And then on a very public platform at a very major political rally in the time of this crisis, our president made an extremely derogatory, homophobic remark. Like he just kind of, and I mean, they'd been doing it for a while, but it was really alarming that it was very blatant, and it was also the way in which it was delivered. Like he delivered it and then he turned around to just laugh with the other men that were seated behind him on the stage. So it was really, you know, it was kind of like, wow, okay, that happened. And then, of course, you know, within days, people organized, and then we were protesting, and, you know, then the protests kind of also became very visibly queer protest, and whatever. But then we also did have this thing of like bringing people together after this incident, and then I was at a meeting where I was like, where were the rest of you when we were, like, we've been on the streets for 2 weeks, and I was like, wait a second, the president needed to make a homophobic slur to get the rest of the queers out, right? And so then we had to have like a really deep conversation about what that meant. I was like, where were you folks? Like, why are you only coming out now? And then obviously we brought everybody out, and there were sex workers and etc. And then we had this thing of like, some of the queer folks being like, I don't want to stand next to the sex workers, and sex workers being like, I don't want to stand next to whatever. So we really had to have a serious conversation again about like, where did we start doing that? Because also, again, it's not something traditionally, it's not the way we organize. Like, we don't organize queer folks. Like, you know, we have like really big movements around working class issues, around wages, and, you know, increasing privatization in Sri Lanka. That's been one of our biggest fights. But I think it was a real moment of reflection that somehow that had happened. Like, this kind of thing this distance had been put between us and other movements and other issues. And I mean, I was just kind of thinking about that as all of you were speaking. Does anyone want to respond to any of the other things that anyone else said? Or ask questions of each other?
Yeah, I wanted to reflect on what Sharmeen was saying about the rise of Muslim fundamentalism in our part of the world, and I think about that a lot because it kind of affects all of the activism that is going on, and I think especially when it comes to Western interventions that are, for example, LGBTIQ, it can really backfire, and certainly seen that in Pakistan. So I always try to think of the bigger frame, which is that Muslim fundamentalism, right wing in Pakistan, is benefiting from the right wing here, right? Like, we don't talk about the right wing here that's been exporting, first of all, like homophobia to a lot of different parts of the world, but also in terms of how the Islamophobia that's generated by the right wing and the industry that is affects, you know, has then justified interventions like the drone attacks in Pakistan that no one seems to talk about, and how that actually affects LGBTQ work in Pakistan, and then also in terms of who gets to the human rights, like, you know, there was this whole decriminalizing homosexuality globally by the Trump administration, super problematic because it's really about Iran. And so you're just starting to peel back the layers of where things line up and which human rights violators are okay, like Saudi Arabia, for example, which is peddling Muslim fundamentalism to poor Muslim countries to define what the Muslim narrative looks like, which has really affected parts of where we call home. And then you look at the Pakistani state that is using the idea of like an anti-Indian narrative in Pakistan to silence civil society. And so there are just so many layers to these issues. And then when I think about the activism that actually is making sense in Pakistan, it is the indigenous activism that is not related to NGOs, that is really about having like the Aurat March, the transgender rights bill that just became law. All of those are very much sort of indigenous movements. That seems to be the only way that it works. So just wanted to kind of think about that.
Yeah, and to go off of that, I think one of the things I think about before I go to sleep is like the rise of the right wing globally, and also the rise of like militancy. So like when we think about Kashmir liberation movements, for example, and I'm only ever going to talk about Kashmir because I love it. It's in 1989, there was an armed insurgency after the Indian military that currently occupies the Indian occupied part of Kashmir really went on a severe crackdown, and so they've been in a state of like mild insurgency since. And what happened was that there was an indigenous resistance movement against occupation that was then really co-opted by these like Islamist fundamentalist groups. And then there's this whole thing where it's like Pakistan like backs, like the Pakistani state like backs them or funds them or trains that, whatever it may be. But I think when I think about my family, because we're from Azad Kashmir, which is the Pakistan occupied part, and how they talk about post-partition, this very indigenous freedom movements that like my grandparents, both my grandparents were like part of, how they were fighting to take their land and to make it free because they thought that it was theirs and like it was being taken away from them without their consent, which is like a completely normal reaction. And then, you know, there's like this entire narrative that Pakistan then perpetuates that, oh, like our people came down from like the northern frontier and we freed this Kashmir that we now call free Kashmir, even though it's still occupied. And then when we think about like the rise of that Islamist fundamentalism and how it played a part in the insurgency and how there's like this really tricky situation where it's like, you know, nobody else has like training and like weapons, and they're actively fighting the Indian occupying forces, but at the same time that they're destroying an indigenous movement by co-opting it for their own purposes, and also instituting this like very fundamentalist Islamist framework within everything they do. And then on top of that, it's just these like militants are not good for the people there either. They killed civilians as well, and they rape civilians as well. And so what do you do when there's no avenue for liberation, when every dissent is quashed, and then this like extreme militancy becomes your only option, but it's not a good option, but you're out of options? So it's just like a never-ending cycle.
Yeah, I think a lot about the divide on analysis around sex work in South Asia. So I have met a lot of Dalit activists. Because caste is such a huge social practice in South Asia, it's both a political practice as well as a social system. You know, endogamy is a huge part of which people get to inherit oppressive work, right? So we're looking at the people who are cleaning out the sewage systems in South Asia are Dalit, lower caste people. So a lot of Dalit activists I meet that are on the other side of the sex work conversation are taking into consideration that they didn't get to choose sex work. So actually the banning of sex work is why they believe it's the only way to address the social inequity as far as who gets to do sex work. So that's why, like, when I hear their opinions, I'm like, okay, is there like a social policy table where we can think about endogamy and how sex work is an inherited social practice with the Devidasi community in different brothels and, you know, poor communities in South Asia, while also talking about the freedom to do sex work with dignity, right? So dignity is the question for a lot of Dalit activists, right? So I think like the nuance isn't always there, because when they are at the table together, it looks like they are in direct opposition to each other. But when you talk more about the nitty-gritty and why they are against the ways in which like the sex work narrative has been, you know, highly influenced by the Western perspective around sex work, they do have some really legitimate claims about the ways in which sex work is inherited through endogamy and caste. So I think like that always, you know, it throws a wrench in the argument, and it throws a really important conversation that I don't think they've had together yet. And that was one thing. And also, like, when I'm thinking about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Bangladesh, I'm also thinking about how our communities have, you know, really been given no option to get public education, to fight and create other social systems that are not replicating this fundamentalism. So the minute that Zulhaz and Tonnoy were murdered, the Hindu American Foundation published a super Islamophobic report about, oh my God, Islamic fundamentalism is on the rise in Bangladesh. We must quell these Islamists. So even with the ways that we get to talk about our narratives, the Hindu right is weaponizing all this narrative to further perpetuate Islamophobia and further perpetuate militarism in our region. So even when we speak, like, we do it with a lot of fear, because anything that we say against Islamic fundamentalism is literally being used to weaponize the Hindu right and the white supremacists. So I say this with like a lot of fear about what happens when we decide to be like, ooh, yeah, like Islam is a beautiful religion in America and we have to honor this story, but we also have to honor the way that it's being weaponized to oppress people.
Okay, I'm gonna shimmy us into the next section. So just to give a little bit of context for anyone in the room that doesn't know before I kind of let Geeta lead us into it. In September last year, the Supreme Court in India gave a very historic verdict on Section 377, which in India is the law in their penal code that criminalize same-sex relations between people. It's a colonial era sodomy law, basically, that has stayed on the books. It's the same in Sri Lanka. We have Section 365 and 365A. In Sri Lanka, there was an interesting development in the 90s where a push to repeal it kind of backfired, and they changed the language to include women. Whereas in a lot of other countries, the sodomy law remains as is, and it is specifically about men. So it specifically criminalizes gay men or men engaging in sex with other men. But yeah, so in Sri Lanka, they kind of, did a little bit of gender equality for us and threw women into the equation in '95, I think. But I'm going to let Geeta talk a little bit about 377 on one hand, and then also the other kind of big sort of conversation that we've been having that has framed our conversation about consent and desire and sex has obviously been Me Too. And then we'll all kind of chip in.
So it's an interesting thing, and we can come back to a couple of things. I mean, there are people sitting in the room who hopefully will make comments about the sex work Meena's issues here from Sangram, and it'll be interesting to see reactions. But also, just for Subha later, I thought one of the claims was the invisibility of lesbian women in queer organizing that led to the inclusion of lesbian women in the Sri Lankan case. So maybe, the fact that our own interventions backfire on us, that we thought we're doing something good and then we get something terrible back. So just to keep that. So the way I was just going to do the 377 conversation in India was to read two paragraphs, and it's actually from the 2009 decision. One paragraph from the decision, one paragraph from a professor and an activist who reacted to that decision. And then just fast forward and tell you that the story of 377 is quite unique, because it's probably the only anti-homosexuality law that has not used the word sexual orientation and gender identity. The use of LGBT was a very, when we were sitting around the table and talking about law, LGBT may not be an organizing category in India at that time, but in international law, because people had to use that language and use other jurisprudence we use the terms. But I think the point I'm trying to make is when we know why we are using the term, it makes sense. And it may not have made sense had it just been decided by a number of LGBT groups that it should be in there. So the 377 was built on the idea of consent, and the ask was decriminalize consenting adults who have sex in private. Very carefully crafted. This took 3 years, just that statement. Because actually it was the work of cross movements, of sitting together and saying, you know what, the LGBT people were saying, no, LGBT, Sogi, look at South Africa. It's mainly forcing people who are homosexual to be beaten and harassed. And slowly, to bring other movements into the conversation, it took a while, because the women's movement said, hello, we are fighting for marital rape to be recognized. Right now, we don't really care about you people having sex whenever you want. We really care about violence that's happening to women in the domestic home. The child rights people were like, okay, this is the only law we have that protects children. So we don't want it to go away. We just want it to stay. There were sex worker rights groups who were saying, well, we have sex, the sex that we want to have with our clients is criminalized. And I think through a 3-year conversation, literally it was Voices Against 377, and Kriya was part of founding that group, but lots of conversation that led to the idea that if we use consent as a pivot, then marital rape gets counted in. Then if we use the word adult, then the children's rights groups then come in. It helps the LGBT groups because it's consensual sex. It works with sex workers again because it's consent to sex. And that, I think, was something quite unique in terms of lawyers and sitting down and discussing. So eventually, when the 2009 decision came out, it was a very progressive decision, and we have continued to use it even after that. And I'm not going to speak about the horrible, criminalization of it, because I don't want to leave everyone on that note, but because it's been. This is what the judge said. If there's one constitutional tenet that can be said to be underlying the theme of the Indian Constitution, it is that of inclusiveness. This court believes that the Indian Constitution reflects this value deeply ingrained in Indian society, nurtured over several generations. The inclusiveness that Indian society traditionally displayed, literally in every aspect of life, is manifest in recognizing a role in society for everyone. Those perceived by the majority as deviant or different are not on that score excluded or ostracized. I mean, there may be issues with the whole tradition, how we're this great society, but by and large, talking about everyone was really something that it made everyone happy, that we actually got everyone who is seen as non-normative to be included, and not just queer people. So Lawrence Liang wrote something which I thought that was quite amazing, because on that day we recorded the day the judgment came out, just recorded what people were thinking in that moment, because everyone was waiting, and you could see people were like crying and smiling, and he says, the Naz Foundation judgment once again makes the Constitution worthy of our love and affection. It is, of course, too early to say whether this romance with Naz will stand the test of time. And like all relationships, there will be disenchantment, disgruntlement, and perhaps even cynicism that will creep in. But for now, let us enjoy the slightly trippy lightheadedness that only a new love is capable of providing, and toast the much delayed but very welcome arrival of Roe v. Wade in India. And I thought, what was interesting is that the Constitution and constitutional morality became the way in which, as activists, we began to frame our work after that, instead of public morality. And that was a big shift. And I think working over the years around this idea of constitutional morality has become a fundamental idea to a lot of activists. So that's on the 377 part. I'm wondering whether people should go through and then I come back to Me Too? Or would that be, no? Okay. So, to the Me Too discussion, and I know that I'm assuming that, do people know that in the Me Too moment in India, what happened is there was a list that got circulated with names of mainly academics and professors that were meant to have harassed. So many feminists got together, and what I'm going to do just to make this faster is talk about some thoughts that we all penned down when this happened. So a list of professors who were seen as sexual harassers was circulated. It was collated by 2 Indian women living in the US. They claimed these names had been sent to them by a large number of other women, but provided no explanation or context of the harassment. It included, 2 men already found guilty of sexual harassment through university committees set up under another law, which we have called the Vishaka Guidelines. It had names of some men known to have had consensual affairs with their students, and women involved made it clear that it was not they who had put the names of their former lovers on the list, and a large number of other names. But these were lists, men in inappropriate but not illegal consensual relationships. There were people. Okay, all these names were simply listed with the information provided above not mentioned, so that convicted men in inappropriate but not illegal consensual relationships, and other men who were supposed to be sexually predatory professors for unspecified behavior were all on the same list. It was also relevant in hindsight that all of them but one were upper caste men. The one non-upper caste man on the list had died a year ago. So this kind of led to a huge outcry by feminists that, that what were people's positions about this. Now, just to understand India, whenever this happens, usually there's a statement that someone writes and then you begin debate and discussion and all that. It's not like a response to the whole thing. So this idea that the academic response to this was this, but it was actually, it's the way people discuss and debate. And people were all on opposite sides, just like they've been on censorship of films. Some people say censor it, some people say no. There was until that moment, there was no personal animosity. People disagreed, they debated, they continued to work together. But I think this is the first time that there were really divisions in the movement around this, and there were older feminists, younger feminists, and it was sad. And it was also sad because you didn't see politicians named, you didn't see people in the Hindu right named on this list, people who we didn't see, even right-wing professors named, who were publicly allied to the right-wing Hindu party. So we came up with 5 things that we debated. And I'm just going to say what those are, and then I'm not going to, it's for you to think or rethink, yeah? What did the lists do? I think they individualized the occurrence of sexual harassment rather than seeing it as a structural problem which can only be tackled collectively. It romanticized the politics of rumor and gossip networks among women over a feminist politics of women standing up to and facing down sexually harassing men. Even with the teacher-student power imbalance, it should have been possible anonymously to specify the behavior. Among the post facto justifications produced by the originators of the list, that this was identify the complainant to the harasser, and thus they justified a culture of victimized silence. The third was, this was accompanied by a call or the idea of believe all women, which can never be a feminist position. Recognizing the other power differences that constitute the category of women, how can we assume that women have no other solidarities other than gender? Every claim made by a woman, even for equal rights, is not necessarily feminist. For women, for instance, women are not untouchable. In the Sabrimala, I mean, these are specific cases in India, so I'll leave it at that. I think one younger critic who was part and felt scared to talk about her critique of the list, said that the list felt to her that its politics reduced feminist consciousness to trauma and sexual violation, thus creating a consensus that the female body is already under threat in a discourse similar to the oppressive one it claimed to be fighting. So the politics of the list, and this is from Nivedita now, Menon. Overall, although it named a real issue, the idea was the responsibility of what people were doing wasn't clear. And that the list, I think, and many of us think, that the list didn't start India's Me Too movement. In fact, the Me Too movement in India learned from the mistakes of the list and marks a break with its politics. It draws its genealogy actually from the Me Too movement in the US, as the claims, anonymous or otherwise, gave context and spelled out the violation. And that's what enabled it to garner widespread support that went beyond the larger feminist movement. So I can stop there. And there was a whole series of questions we asked, but I think that gives you, yeah. Okay, so maybe 3 more lines, which is, one of the things people spoke about is that the silence around sexuality, violence, and desire was broken almost 4 decades ago by feminists in India, because people kept thinking, oh, now we're talking about these issues. But gradually, the other silences masked by that speech began to open up. And we must recognize that there is no moment of pure speaking up that liberates absolutely. as speech proliferates, there will be more arguments and more conversations. Equality and freedom will always be horizons that structure our politics, but they will keep receding as new voices emerge, new claims and new notions of freedom. Saying that, this shouldn't be a surprise that we're having this robust discussion, because the ideas, there's new players, there's new actors, there's technology. And so this was a group of feminists that sat together and penned down these thoughts around Me Too.
Okay, so I'd just like to respond to that, because actually in the last few weeks, a kind of beginning of a sort of a Me Too moment in the Sri Lankan sort of online space has started. Obviously we've been having conversations in physical spaces about how we locate ourselves in Sri Lanka in terms of Me Too, and also about why it hasn't happened for us, right? Like, we've all just been having these conversations, being like, why isn't it happening? And obviously everyone has various analyses and theories about why it didn't necessarily happen in the same way for us. But a couple of weeks ago, there were a few things on Twitter that then led to some women saying, okay, well, my inbox is open, like if anyone wants to write in. And we'll protect your identity, but we will, tell your story. And that was interesting as well, because then we also had a conversation about what you were saying, Geeta, this question of like also how these things happen and the actual politics of the logistics of it, right? So for me, actually, I'm also a little bit uncomfortable with overly protecting the people that want to tell their stories. Because I also think that, again, because there's multiple layers of vulnerability. Like, I'm a fairly privileged middle-class woman. I should probably be able to publicly name my, right? Technically. Whether I want to or not is a different story. So when there was all this kind of conversation around, women saying, okay, write to me, like, I will protect your identity, like, my inbox, our inboxes are open. So then we also had to talk about, but then how do movements move if nobody takes risks, right? Like, if, like, people have fought and died for this stuff. People are fighting and dying for this stuff still. Like, to what extent do we mitigate risk? And to what extent do we kind of also protect the people that need to be protected? So it's happening on Twitter. So we can also assume that it's a fairly middle class to upper middle class conversation. So I was also kind of disturbed by that, like this kind of overemphasis on protecting people's identities if they want to speak, because I don't know that then that movements can really move if people haven't chosen and made that decision for themselves to take that risk in that moment. So I was also kind of wondering a little bit about the politics of that. I also think, just to add to what you were saying, that like the whole Me Too conversation in Sri Lanka, so the sort of primary analysis that most of us had was that we're too small a community, right? And a lot of what I heard women saying was saying, we can't afford to burn these bridges. These are not men that we can publicly name, like these are also our friends, our colleagues, my boss, etc., etc. We're too small knit a community to do this whole like the thing of like publicly outing. Now I think that's interesting, because I actually think that kind of produces an interesting illustration of a different possibility, because then what do you do, right? Because it is true for all our contexts that we have to continue living with our perpetrators unless we are signing up for some crazy strategy of I don't know, like, what do we do once people have been named? Like, then what, right? Do we can we push them out? We're not for incarceration anyway, let's be real. Many of these men aren't ever going to be incarcerated because our prison systems don't work like that. Where privileged men are ever going to be incarcerated, and anyway, we don't necessarily want that. So I think the Sri Lankan context also produced a kind of an interesting problem in terms of like, okay, so what you're saying is actually we have to carry on living with these people. We have to carry on working with them. We also may have conflicted feelings about them. We may not, it may not be so easy to say perpetrator as it is. So, I mean, I was also like very conscious of that we couldn't kind of force a Me Too in that way because there were a lot of other things to, and I do think that some of it is good and some of it is difficult and whatever. I'm gonna go back to you guys.
This is really very exciting, Charlotte Bunch. And I just want to say a couple of things. I was in a conversation about Me Too and feminism with Ashwini Tambe, who many of you may know is an editor of feminist studies at the University of Maryland the other day. And we were reflecting on many of these same questions. So I just want to share sort of some ideas that came out of that conversation. I think she's writing something about this. But part of what I think you were saying, and I want to say, is that as feminists, we have to remember that the Me Too movement was not created by our feminist movement. And so the challenge is always, how do we bring our feminism to the moments that occur in the public that weren't necessarily our strategy, but that we should be providing a context for. So I think it's not so much whether we like it or don't like it, because it happened out of the same impulses that feminism comes from, but not necessarily from a feminist strategy. So a couple of the things we were talking about was, all right, this is something in the public. How do we bring context to it? And one of those points was what you just said, Giga, which is, all right, how do we get people to think about this? These are individual stories about a systemic problem, and a structural problem. And how do we get people to start to receive them that way? And to remind them that actually speak outs about violence against women have been happening in India, in parts of Latin America, and the US since the 1970s at least. That's my story. I don't claim there may have been some before. So it's not a new phenomenon. So to try to get the media to understand that what's important about this is the way in which those stories are getting attention, not to pretend that there hasn't ever been this discussion. And I think a big part of that is putting that structural context, not to say the women shouldn't say their stories, but how to make it more than just about the individual women or the list of men. Because in fact, of course, the worst stories are often not from celebrities or even professors, but from people whose ability to tell their story is even less than those who are telling. So to bring the bigger picture of those stories. The second thing she said, which I hadn't thought about, is what do we want out of it? And do we want to make, we know we don't want incarceration, at least most of us don't, because that's clearly not very effective. But we want the men who are being accused and the society at large to have a real conversation in which men begin to see the harm they have done. So she was saying, what if we could find a way, instead of saying, just shaming men and they should disappear, that they should engage in conversation, either with the women who they've harmed or with the women who are talking about this in that context, about how they now understand the harm that has been done and what they might do by way of community service or participation in other movements and issues, et cetera. So I think it's really, to me, the question is, how do we rethink how we give a response? This issue didn't come from us. I mean, the issue has. We've been doing this for 40 years. But how do we take the moment and try to reframe it for the public so they learn something? They learn about Ni Una Menos in Latin America. They learn about the Delhi protests around the bus system or the women's speak-outs in the 70s, et cetera, and begin to think about it in a broader context. So those are just two pieces to add to that.
Yeah, I think, I think it's hard for me to not see Me Too as actually birthed out of Black queer feminist thought, because it is like coming from, I mean, you could watch Tarana Burke's TED Talk where she talks about this specifically, about the way in which Me Too has taken its turn, but I don't think that's the fault of the people who are speaking out, writing lists, and writing these public posts. I actually think because we had no public venue to do the accountability work, people have resorted to these lists and Twitter posts in order to have some sort of public conversation. So actually, you know, when people were indicting Raya, who was one of the authors of the list, also a Dalit feminist, so it's important to put in perspective that she was indicted by majority upper caste Savarna academics for writing this list. So there is a dynamic there about who gets to criticize a Dalit woman who has authored this list. And then also the fact that, like, when that happened, you know, Raya had to go underground. Raya is now getting attacked by Hindutva trolls, by all the folks that are like upset at her for publishing this list. There was a lot of violence that she had to face for even beginning this conversation. So I think when the academic community wrote a letter to raise these concerns, right concerns, I think they bring up an important conversation piece. I think it kind of placed the responsibility on the survivors to have some sort of like public narrative that the public could get with in order to be believed. So I'll bring that to an anecdote, because when we accused somebody of sexual violence on a top level museum of New York City that was bringing on this like abuser to an advisory board, the museum board asked for the same thing. Where are the receipts? Can you show us evidence? How many of us know survivors in this room that have a detailed report of the abuse they faced? I would argue close to none, right? Like, as a survivor, I didn't go write a diary entry of the details the day it happened, right? In many ways, some of us experience amnesia. Some of us experience like not even remembering, right? So I think that that creates a whole mystery and a whole question about how do we tell stories that aren't necessarily ready to be told? Do the stories need to be told is also a big question that came up with this. And I think like as survivors, we have to think of like what is the complexity that we have to hold without indicting the survivors, because I felt what happened was an indictment of all the people who came out to accuse these high-level professors of abuse. And you're right, abuse is a, you know, it's a spectrum. There are consensual relationships that are fucked up. There's abuse that happens on multiple levels. But I think like for a lot of survivors, the list was one of the only conversations that has ever been had about this. So I try to hold that nuance, because I think what it brought on was actually like a shutting down of the conversation versus continuing the conversation.
My name is Meena Seshu, and I work with the Sex Workers Collective in rural India. It's called WAMP. No, I just wanted to react to this this thing of, you know, Raya Sarkar and the list, because this whole idea that it was Raya was a Dalit woman and there were these Savarna women who were, you know, writing this response to Raya is, you know, it's like an afterthought. Nobody knew that Raya was from a Dalit feminist. Nobody knew when they were reacting to what Raya did. So I think we need to keep that historical perspective, that they were not reacting to a woman who, you know, they felt as Savarna feminists, they had to put down a Dalit woman who had done this list. So I think historically we need to be very clear on that. They were reacting like feminists, like what Charlotte just said, and I totally agree with you. And, you know, that we have been fighting for due process for years now, at many levels, for many things as feminists. And I think that was purely a reaction that came out of the gut in that way. Okay, it was done badly. It was done with tremendous arrogance, which I think we older feminists have to claim, that we are very arrogant. And, you know, it's come from years of work maybe, but it's true. And I think the tone of the letter was wrong, but the politics of the letter was not wrong. And I think that is something that we really need to be very, very clear in this room. So that's one. And the second thing that I'd like to talk about is this Devadasi system. Like Aarti and I were just talking, and she was saying, you know, how many Devadasis have come up to the Dalit leaders and said, we have a voice, maybe use it? And the Dalit leaders said no. And from WAMP, there is a very, very important quote of one of the women who said that what you have done to us as sex workers and Devadasis is what the Savarna women have done to Dalit women all along. Right? You're killing our voice. You're not allowing us to speak. And don't speak for us, please. And I think that's a very important learning too. I'm no Brahmin, but I'm just telling you that the understanding that everything is messed up because it's, Savarna women who are having a very negative, purposeful, clamping down on the Dalit voice is not the entire narrative. There are multiple narratives over there, and I think we agree and understand that, yes, people like Raya did what they thought was right. I'm no woman who judges anything. I come from the sex workers movement. I'm a non-judgmental type about everything, right? So I'm not saying what Raya did was wrong, but I think we need to have a better historical analysis of what happened. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Khadija. I work with the Queer Muslim Youth Group that Aruj and Anka are both involved with. And I just wanted to ask about, I know that there, particularly in India, was a lot of student activism in various realms and has been for a long time. 2015 and 2016, JNU, I know there's conversations of gender and these issues brought up. I'm wondering, in the recent months and with 377 and Me Too, how young people, particularly students, are involved in showing up and leading these sort of movements in your various contexts.
Does anyone have anything else? I mean, we can take a couple of things at once and then respond.
It's not really a question. I think I just had a comment to follow up on what you said about visibility, because from where I come from, the queer movement for a very long time has been very invisible. Like, yes, we've been doing the work for so long, but it's very hard to pin down people. Like, you can, like when you say queer movement in Kenya, you have like 2-3 people that you can point out, but the rest of the activists, especially the leaders, are very, for lack of a better word, closeted, yeah? And for a long time, we've had that battle in our country where we're just like, why are we so afraid? Like, most of you people are middle class, like privileged people who very little harm would come to. But you see the people on the front line are people who have everything to lose, you know? So when you say that, what happens to movement when we are invisible? Like, if people are not even ready to come out and say that I'm queer and I'm here, when they have very little to lose in terms of respectability or jobs or being attacked. Like, they lived in gated communities. Like, what's the worst that could happen to you, you know? And so when I'm here, for example, people ask me all the time, like, why are you visible? Like, why do you choose to live visibly? And I ask myself all the time, so what's the other option? Like, then, you know, like, so I don't even know how to respond to that, because somebody asked me when I was on a panel, and I was just like, that's a question. Like, so what do you want me to tell you? Like, what's the answer? I don't know. I don't know why I'm visible. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for being visible. Yeah, I mean, I think I always kind of try to think of it in terms of like my own privilege, and I just feel like that's just the best thing I can do with it. I think I'll just quickly respond to your thing. The student movements in Sri Lanka have been really mostly galvanized around privatization, the issue of privatization, and the huge risk of privatization that we're kind of on the brink of right now, and keeping education free and accessible and equal to all. But obviously within student movements, of course, there are major concerns about gender that don't always get expressed publicly in the sort of language of the movement, but we know that inside a lot of young women in student movements are really challenging student movement leadership, which has been obviously historically male, and that's one thing that I know is happening right now. I also know that there is a list of men I'm just going to say academics, professors who have been sort of accused of sexual harassment within the university system in Sri Lanka. But so it's interesting, but that's not public, but like we all know it's there, and the women in the university system know it's there, and they add to it frequently. Does anyone else want to? Yeah.
So Pakistan is 70% young people, so so they're at the forefront of all these movements, like the Aurat March that just happened, and not the 377 piece, because we have it too, but that's not somewhere we're ready to go. But in terms of the transgender rights, there's also been a lot of young people.
So in terms of Me Too, I think the context that I know it best is probably within American Muslim circles, and there was like a really, you probably know this, Khadija, but like early last year, there was like some kind of viral Facebook post, something that really like gained a lot of traction around a certain religious leader, a Muslim religious leader named Numan Ali Khan, and there was like all this stuff that I think what I'm constantly hearing is missing in the discussion about Me Too is like really an analysis of power and how power is really a dynamic that is informing so much of the abuse that happens. And when we think about religious communities and like that, sexual abuse or abuse of power, Muslims, I think, are often left out of the conversation. I was recently having a discussion with some folks about like the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse there, and how even that is so little talked about, and that's all like a power thing. And I think, especially when you think of conservative Muslim communities where there's a lot of gender segregation, but the only time gender mixing is allowed is when there's like a male religious leader, and oftentimes like young women or young boys. Like there's a lot of abuse and corruption that happens there that is all covered up in the name of preserving, like, I don't like to use the word, but like honor for lack of a better word, and like the idea of the shame that comes with it, because there is no analysis of the power that one can hold over somebody else like that. So I think that like social media has been a huge tool for like Muslim people to kind of galvanize the Me Too movement. There's a nonprofit in Chicago, Heart Women and Girls, that like has also been doing some work on that as well. So I think that the conversation could start to be opening, but I don't think it's gaining traction in the way that it should or needs to. But I know there's like tons of folks who are working on it, and I think that once that kind of structural analysis is brought into the picture, then we can have like a real conversation moving forward, including like how do you hold someone accountable? Like you don't just like fire the person from one mosque and then transfer them to another mosque 100 miles away. That is not a solution for anyone. That is perpetuating a cycle. So, and then again, thinking about transformative justice and how we want to avoid incarceration. There's just so many questions that have been unanswered, and I think that there are real moves to answering those.
Okay, so on that note, we're gonna wrap up, but obviously we can, continue chatting informally afterwards. I just want to give a big shout out to Vaishali and Hima and Juhi, amazing South Asian videography crew. Like, how did we manage that? That's amazing. And from Geeta and myself both, thank you so much all for coming. And we wanted to just end on a bit of a fun note. Oh.
We want to also thank Astrea for the space. Because the idea of Rethink Evening, I mean, what a great space to also have this kind of an event. So thank you so much for saying yes in 1 second.
Yeah, no, really, oh my God. Thank you, because it was really important for us to have it in a political space, and it's super special to come to our Astrea family and to have done this with you folks.